This is the latest of our BCS meetings, events that we managed to keep going through the year, despite the restrictions. And we're very pleased with that it is a joint event tonight with AMAC. Just before I introduce our speaker, who really needs no introduction at all, of course, I'd just like to say that I think the Zoom meetings have been a real bonus and have gone extremely well. And we will look how we can continue these in future. But now that the restrictions are beginning to be released, I know the committee are looking at how we can revert or return to some of our previous style of events. Well, as I said, our speaker needs no introduction at all. Dr. Bojan is one of the staunchest and long-standing friends of the British Croatian Society. He studied at Sarajevo University, where he got his degree, I think, in English literature and music. Went to Oxford in 1963 for his PhD, and on completing that, was a lecturer at Reading University before returning to Oxford to Magdalen College, Oxford, where he remained for 30 years and is now an emeritus member of it, having been director for music there, lecturer and professor of music there. Tonight he's going to talk about a remarkable book in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. Its links to Ruđer Bošković and another Dubrovnik, well-known cultural figure. And I think that is probably enough from me, so I shall hand over to the next speaker, indeed to our speaker.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you all for all these introductions. And I ought to say, first of all, that I am not a literary scholar. Yes, indeed, is one of my subjects when I was an undergraduate at Sarajevo University was Slavonic philology, but that's far from musicology, and that's really what I proceeded to do for the rest of my active life. Therefore, I would need really somebody else to discuss this with. And I knew of the exact person with whom I would have wanted to discuss this, and that is Dinko Ranjina, a very good friend of mine. Okay, well, this is the title, as you see. I have left it in the spelling of the original edition of 1563, and I decided to move this along as a kind of dramatic presentation. So we have a list of characters, dramatis personae. There's Dinko Ranjina or Domenicus Araneus. Take it in Croatian, Italian, or Latin. Then there's Ruđer Bošković, mathematician, philosopher, astronomer, Jesuit, a man who hardly needs me to tell you anything about him, but you may not have ever come across, unless scholars of France, across Charles Nodier, writer and librarian, let alone a bookshop, or rather a family firm of book dealers in late 18th and early 19th century Paris. But a few years ago, I needed to look at the copy of Dinko Ranjina's Piesni, razlike, different or collected poems, and knowing that in the Bodleian Library we have the original 1563 edition, I ordered it rather than having to go to another library in Oxford where the modern edition is kept. When I say modern edition, it's the 1898 Zagreb edition. But here he is, a patrician from an influential Dubrovnik family, poet, later politician, and on several occasions, knez or rettore of the Republic. And the important point about Ruđer Bošković is that in between 1773 and 1783, he was resident in France. And it turned out from this Oxford copy as a lateral evidence that he inspected that particular copy at one point. The copy was then, at the beginning of the 19th century, in the list of the Varé family. Varé family were several generations of booksellers and very distinctive, distinguished also antique book dealers in Paris. Whether they owned the copy or whether they were just acting as agent for somebody else, it's not quite sure, but nevertheless, they are instrumental in one particular sense, because it was from them that Charles Nodier borrowed this copy. And Charles Nodier is an interesting character. His political career finished with Napoleon's departure from power, but he later became a very distinguished librarian and head of various library institutions in Paris. But during the Provence Illyrienne, he was resident in Trieste and in Ljubljana. And it is there that he got interested in what he calls Slavonic poets and took his duty very seriously, I suppose, as the censor, and learnt, as he said, the Slavonic language, although we don't know what he learned, Slovenian or Croatian. So anyway, here it is, the title page of the Oxford copy of Dinko Ranjina's Piesni, razlike. It's what attracted my attention was that it's such a beautifully printed exemplar and extremely well preserved. It is evident that it saw very little use in its life. But there were some papers tucked into it. And I alerted the Bodleian authorities to point out that these were important details showing us something about the history of the book. And we'll now start from there. Here it is. Various poems by Dinko Ranjina, in which he tells everything that happened to him through love while staying in the Italian city of Zante. Zante is, of course, the modern Zakynthos amongst the Ionian Islands, which at that time was Venetian territory. And this is why he calls it an Italian city, because for all intents and purposes, it was primarily in an Italian language sphere. The publishers in Florence were themselves very distinguished. Not any longer Lorenzo Torrentino, who died in 1562, but his sons. And now we go further. And just to point out the locations of various residencies of Dinko Ranjina. He says that he was at Zante. I'm sorry I've lost my laser pointer, but it doesn't really matter. You can still see this arrow. Although most of the time he was really resident here in Messina, in a colony of Dubrovnik merchants. But he was obviously interested to move, as you see, from one territory to another. This is Venetian territory, this is Spanish territory. And eventually he will find his way to the territory of the Duchy of Tuscany. And there we are, as you see, 16th and 17th century map at the beginning of the turn of the century, from a very popular atlas of that time. the book's travels between 1563 and the time when it ended up in the hands of a French collector, not in Paris, but in Reims. It was at the time when Bošković was in France. And this is what happened. The text that is preserved in the Bodleian copy is in fact a 19th century copy by an English hand of a document that dated from the 18th century and which was written in French, and it was copied in French. There is no English version. This is my translation of it. And this anonymous to us owner explains that Bošković was indeed able to tell him that it was written in the Slavonic tongue, and told him that Ranjina came from an old patrician family, and pointed out at that time in 1774, one of Ranjina's was the Republic's ambassador in St. Petersburg. But it's interesting that the translations that Bošković provided were not into French, and we know that Bošković was very fluent in French. He translated everything into Latin. And as this description says, that he also translated the heading of the dedicatory epistle and some sentences which are found below it and below the text on the last page of the book. We'll see that that's not exactly what this says. It's a rather more interesting story than that. And then we come to the right, an interesting point here. As you see when you read this text, I don't have to repeat it, that he was reluctant to comment on the literary value of the work because he felt that his appreciation of the literature is not good enough, that his language was still probably language of his childhood and not of a sophisticated Dubrovnik speaker, because for the rest of his life, as he himself stated, he cultivated Italian, Latin and French at the expense of his first language. So, and this is what Bošković produced. This is his version of the original Croatian version, which you've seen there, and also the title of this particular dedication to Miho Menčetić. And this is the little piece of paper stuck in the book in the Bodleian, which copies Bošković's translation. This is the text, and this is the English rendition of this Latin text. And this is the manuscript of a copy of the letter which Charles Nodier wrote to one of the members of the Varé family. We don't know exactly which one because he only addressed him by the firm's name, and this is Monsieur Varé Oncle. So let's call this recipient Varé Oncle. And this is what Nodier said to him in a rather self-promoting way, as you see. Believing myself to be the only man in Europe to attach any importance to the poetry of Ranjin. This is his spelling, and he always underlines it. I had hoped to acquire his book very cheaply. The high price you asked for it leads me to suppose that the collector you satisfied would be unlikely to cede me this Slavonic book. And then, interestingly, he points out that he has a project of translating Slavonic poetry into French. And also is the fact that he had other manuscript poems of Ranjina, and concludes in a rather intriguing way that in exchange for this opportunity to inspect the copy better, he could offer some very curious details about the author. Alas, we never know, and why and what Nodier wanted us to know what would be so interesting. But we'll try to glean this and that about Ranjina from this book. To go back to it, there you are. The Bodleian shelf mark says Mason T 115. That betrays the origin and even the date of the arrival of the book into the Bodleian Library. In 1844, not later, some money had to be spent that the Bodleian Library received in bequest from a rich donor called Robert Mason. A lot of expensive and valuable books were bought for that money. And because we know that Mason specified that the money had to be spent three years after his death, and he died in 1841, we know that the book couldn't have come later than 1844. So let's look further at it. First of all, it's in folio format. It's a large book, unusual for books of poetry in mid-16th century Italy, or that part of the world in general. And it's also rather interesting how the imagery of the book is rather revealing, because it tells us at least the intentions of somebody who wants to communicate, not just through poetic images, but also through visual ones. What is also interesting about this copy in Oxford is its Florentine appearance. As you see, in a very prominent place here is the Medici coat of arms, the palle. Here you have a little vista of Florence. Here is the Duomo. And the publishers are the children, sons of Lorenzo Torrentino, who was a favorite printer of Cosimo Medici, Cosimo I, Duke of Florence. And you can see how ubiquitous the central position of Medici coat of arms was everywhere in Florence at the time. Cosimo wanted to raise the prestige and the level of the importance of the Medici family, now becoming hereditary princes of Florence, and everything was somehow subsumed to that. Medici coat of arms was everywhere. Medici imagery was everywhere. Medici portraits and sculpted figures were everywhere. And this is one particular theatrical performance of 1589, and you can see this central position just as it is here in the title page of Ranjina's book. However, rather conveniently, the Zagreb copy, kept in the Library of the Croatian Academy, is digitalized and available to me online. And I had a surprise when I saw that the Zagreb copy has a different title page. As you see, it's still Medici, But the Medici have the text is the same, and this is an idealized classical landscape, very typical of Renaissance illustrations and books. In fact, there is more to this design than that, because we will see, you see the difference here. You can also see how much better preserved the Oxford copy is, because there are many more marks and obviously signs of wear and tear in the Zagreb copy, but there isn't none of that in the Oxford one. And look at this here. You will see that it's what I call, that is Lorenzo Torrentino's ready-mades. They are in fact woodcuts, which are used as a universal title page, in this particular case for an edition of Pausanias Descriptio Graecae, and in this case the famous Leon Battista Alberti, L'Architettura. I was responsible also for bringing out the first edition of Vasari's Vitae. And this is supposed to be based on a design provided by Vasari himself. But as I said, there is imagery seems to be important, because as we go into the book, we become rather aware of that kind of thing. In any case, Ranjina is very good playing with words. First of all, as you see, the name of the man, and in Italian, there's a ragno, a spider here with his web. But he also plays with a different Croatian connection, so that Ranjina and Ranjan, wounded, becomes a very valuable poetic conceit for our Ranjina. Here, he's wearing a distinction of an order which was given to him in Rome. Older Croatian editors of Ranjina have claimed that this is the order of San Stefano, but it isn't, because this engraving predates the date of his election to the order of chivalrous order of San Stefano, instituted by Cosimo Medici. Anyway, let's go with imagery. And you see that he plays with this because in a very prominent place, early in the book, there is this device, a medal, if you want, an engraving with these two symbols of a strange-looking scorpion, or rather ragno spider, and the serpent in this paradise or paradisical surround. The interesting thing is that Ingenio non veribus is a motto that can be traced to a sermon by St. Bernard of Clairvaux, where he says that it was the serpent who interrogated and tempted Eve, knowing that serpents should work with the mind of the woman through ingenuity and not through force, viribus. But it's a strange thing to put in a book of poetry, and you wonder whether, in fact, by that time, there's also a change in the symbolic significance of the whole thing, that somehow the two are opposing each other, so that Ranjo here is some sort of nemesis that hangs above this idea of sin that is hinted at in the medal, and of course through St. Bernard's, borrowing from St. Bernard's. Whether Ranjina read St. Bernard's sermons or whether it got through to him through one of those compendia of useful words and phrases, we of course cannot be sure at all. And it's a question to what extent such biblical connotation with a negative, critical, as it were, view could in any way fit into what Ranjina wanted to achieve in the book. The represented in symbolic ways. So much so that in 1593, Cesare Ripa brought out an encyclopedia of all possible meanings of gestures, of animals, of forms and shapes, etc. And there he says that there are these particular images of the spider that seem to direct us towards human weakness in sense of temporality and easily being disrupted, something weak and subtle like spider's web or cobweb. This, by the way, both of these references are lost in the authorized version and in the Protestant versions of the Bible, so don't look into your Bibles at home unless you have Douai Catholic English Bible. And this is why I've taken quotations from the Catholic Bible rather than a Protestant one. And it's interesting that there is nothing of this St. Bernard's in idea of the serpent or anything negative in Paolo Veronese's symbolic representation of the virtue of industry. We would now, industria, we would now say diligence, really, completed in 1574, because obviously to him, the representation of the diligence is through this very precise spider's web being admired and elevated by this gesture of the hand. And I said that there were some curious sentences at the end of the dedication and at the end of the book. And the 18th century owner in France thought that Bošković translated them from some to him unknown language, which Bošković must have known because it was part of a Slavonic language. But in fact, all Bošković did was to read it the right way, or rather the wrong way. Sorry, for a moment, I was taking a sip of water. Because if you reverse the order, you get a perfectly sensible Latin text. But what is curious further is that this is really a compilation of two different quotations. One comes from Cicero. It is from the treatise called De Finibus Bonorum et Malorum, usually translated into English as On Moral Ends, whereas this comes from the first book of Ovid's Metamorphoses. And when you put it together, plausible English translation is that We have been by our very nature inspired to goodness, because we have been given a countenance turned skywards. Why is this written in this particular way, and why it is there? Let's try and probe further. Because now we come to the end of the book. And on that last page, there's a much longer, three lines here, with certain mistakes here in the typesetting, so that if you reverse, you get wrong. You have to read wrongly to get the correct inversion. And again, it's not original. It is something that derives from Plutarch's Moralia. But life is too short, and Plutarch's Moralia is an extraordinarily long book. And my Greek isn't up to that. But luckily, it was possible to trace it to a Renaissance compendium of useful phrases compiled by Erasmus of Rotterdam. And then Ranjina adapted it further and says this: just as a source never runs dry of water which gushes from it, so joy always comes to a virtuous person, even if outwardly circumstances may alter. We have no idea what is there. But we know at least something about Ranjina's movements. Let's try and follow these. The intention about these quotations are to do with goodness, pride, virtues, and circumstances. The changing circumstances is equally puzzling. But several points of historical context might be worth pursuing. A few years after the publication of Piesni, Razlike in Florence, Ranjina was made Knight of the Order of San Stefano, as I pointed right before. The fact is also that he found himself in Florence 4 years after the Peace of Cateau-Cambrésis, or Peace of Cambrai, where long wars between the Habsburgs and the Bourbons were brought to an end, and where finally all French aspirations for control on the Italian peninsula were brought to an end, and Spain became the dominant force, controlling the Kingdom of Naples and the Kingdom of Sicily and the Kingdom of Sardinia. Venice, of course, controlled Zante. Venice was outside the Habsburg-Bourbon clashes and slightly to one side, just like Dubrovnik. And because Cosimo needed also somebody who could help him with various information about various political and other events around these parts, Ranjina might have been a useful person to concentrate on. After all, Cosimo was extremely interested in furthering, as I said, the line and the connections of the Medici family. So that, see, I've got something wrong here. The Medici in Ranjina's time, as you see, were extremely well connected. Cosimo, the first Duke, later Grand Duke, married Eleonora da Toledo, daughter of the Viceroy of Naples, Spanish representative. His son Francesco married the daughter of Ferdinand of the First Habsburg. So he was then connected with all these great royal families. And also at the same time, he diverged from the predominant hitherto earlier Medici politics, which favored the French. And he detached himself from the French and played the Habsburg line, whether the Western, whether the Central European branches of it. At the same time, in 1563, Lodovico Dolce included 26 of Ranjina's sonnets in his representative collection of mid-century Italian poetry, Rime scelte da diversi autori. Therefore, he was trying to establish himself both in the Italian and in the Croatian literary fields. And this is maybe why somebody in Cosimo's retinue around Cosimo or Cosimo on the other hand, I could propose the opposite and say that it's really difficult to know whether Ranjina really was important or whether all these symbolic images and puzzles in the book are components of his own trying to make himself more important than he was. He was a colorful character. He traveled a lot. He absconded with some money from Dubrovnik and had to be chased by the members, by the edicts of the Grand Council, etc., etc. Although that didn't prevent him from later in the career becoming a distinguished member of all the greater council or the lesser council or the council of the invited, or being the Knez Rettore of the Republic. After all, he also had a distinguished ancestor in, I suppose, in whose footsteps he may have wanted to progress. And that ancestor is Lovro Ranjina, or let's call him Lorenzo Ranjina, as he was, whose career was extraordinary in the sense that he started, as all patricians of Dubrovnik, in the public service of the Republic. But in the early 1500s, he went to Italy and rose very soon to one of the most distinct and highest judicial positions in the proper Florentine Republic at the time when the Medici were exiled from Florence. He was also very close to Pier Soderini, who was the Republic's head of state. But in 1512, the Florentine Republic came to an end. The Medici returned, albeit as clients of the Pope, but Ranjina and Soderini had to leave. They became literally political refugees and came back to Dubrovnik, where Ranjina offered Soderini shelter in his villa at Orašac. And then you see, Ranjina became the Rettore of the Republic in 1515 and 1518 and 15, and also member of all the big councils. This gives us an idea that maybe all these machinations of Ranjina, all these images of him trying to be important, are somehow related to this ambition, whether realized or not. And indeed, you wouldn't have really written comments on, particularly from him, about him being of service to Cosimo or the secret service of the Florentine Republic. A detailed history of the Dubrovnik diplomacy still remains to be written. Much is still unexplored. And for Croatian historians, Venice and the Vatican were traditionally always considered to be the most important archives, while the Florentine ones, particularly Archivio di Stato, are inadequately explored. And Archivio di Stato is a repository of all sorts of documents, pieces of paper, scraps, etc. It is said, in fact, that the Medici in Florence invented bureaucracy and they preserved everything. So there's a little challenge that I offer to Croatian historians, a younger generation, to try and work in Archivio di Stato and try and find out more about Ranjina. As you say, as I said, he's likes to play with meanings because on the last page of the book, and I copied here from the Zagreb edition because I didn't copy it earlier from the Bodleian, and now the restrictions and COVID prevent me from doing so. So there's a rather more marked Zagreb copy, in fact, instead of a rather more pristine Oxford one. And he puts this, and again, this idea of Ranjan, this Petrarchan conceit, which is of course characteristic of the poets of that time, either in Croatian or in Italian, is combined with something that, as you see, takes place in the public sphere. He who is fed by the crowd talks about the crowd, and the wounded one, etc. Again, mixing this public persona and the very private Petrarchan conceit, a real mark of a poet who sees himself practicing his poetry, even if through that he somehow wants to send a political message. But I don't know any more than that. And I think I've detained you enough. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Bojan. I think any words I add to that would just be superfluous, but just simply to say thank you for a wonderful talk that opened up so many avenues of interest. I'm longing to look at a recording of it again. I wish I could inflict it on so many Remainer Britons who think that Europe has no cultural links. And I'm deeply grateful to you and to Amak for this evening. Thank you very much. It's been a wonderful hour and a half.